So, Lyndon,
Yes, Tom.
so nice to see you again. You know what we're doing here? We're doing 24 hours in Shanghai, but we're having to do it digitally because obviously we can't travel. Such a shame not to be there, but 24 hours is really about connecting with our old friends and finding new ones as well.
Wow,
But you're our oldest friend in Shanghai, right? So you are number one dealer of Tom Dixon,
that's
and
correct.
we'll be eternally grateful for that launch into the Chinese market, right? But tell me, are you still doing Design Republic and the store?
Of course, we continue to do that. That's important because I think it's imperative to bring design consciousness to not just the city, but the country as a whole. And I think our mantra has always been from the very get-go when we brought you in and all the other brands that people were not familiarized with or not familiar with, to sort of bring this sort of rigor and intensity. And so we continue to do that with old friends like you and old brands like you. Now you guys are an institution. You were an upstart then, but now you're, of course, a big brand. But we need to continue to do both and balance it. So it's been exciting, and I think Design Republic is probably going to a different phase as well, in which we're trying to go into the hotel sector and the real estate sector.
So I'm kind of interested in the evolution of businesses just generally, and because you landed from another planet, you know, from the States, right? From
Correct.
working in quite big architectural offices to start your own thing in Shanghai. I mean, we're talking about what, 15 years ago? Is that
Six,
right?
17 years ago.
17 years ago. And I was just wondering, you know, when you were dreaming about doing your own thing in the States and looking at China as this kind of amazing series of opportunities, did you think it would end up like it is now, or did you have a different vision?
I never really dream of having my own practice, Tom, to be honest with you. And when I was in the US, I was very happy. I worked for Michael Graves. It was, even though it was a fairly large practice, it was rather boutique in its approach. So I was quite content. I was happy. We have good clients. I had three very young kids. So that was never my plan. But what happened was I came here for a project called Three in the Bun. I think you're familiar with that, that Michael Graves had designed, and I was the associate in charge for that project. And that was the time when we came here. Initially, it was supposed to be only for 10 weeks. Right before 10 weeks was over, SARS came. This was before COVID, that first sort of, crazy, we didn't, pandemic. And I could not fly back. And I had my three kids. The youngest was literally 2 months old. And I have no choice but to say. So that 10 weeks, and the client really enjoyed me being here because decisions were being made rather, hey, I mean, at that speed, we had to make decisions fast. And so that dragged on. And it went from 10 weeks to 6 months, 6 months to 9 months, 9 months to a year, and the project completed. And by then, I saw the energy, sort of energy behind the scenes that you would never normally see just coming and visiting for a week. And I was shocked at how many people were making things, from phones to all the gadgets that you see, to furniture, to some of our contemporaries that refuse to admit that they're all made in China during that time. I saw firsthand how they were made here, and that was exhilarating.
Right. And obviously, I've not been to China for more than a year now, and Shanghai, it's a cliche, but it's constantly mutating at a speed that I think people in the West don't really comprehend. What's been happening? What's the current situation? I mean, obviously for us here in Europe, we're still in the middle of the pandemic. Fascinating to hear that your history is topped and tailed by pandemics, right? So that your business is actually thanks to an earlier pandemic. But you've come out of COVID obviously much earlier than us. But what is the current state of Shanghai in terms of just energy?
Absolutely, I would say absolutely insane. I think there is this energy. A lot of people can't go out, they can't travel, and you know that the travel industry was heavily reliant on Chinese tourists, especially in Europe and the US. And so you can kind of see the bent up um, need for people who want to travel. So naturally, there is a growth in the hospitality sector because now people can't go to Europe, so they travel within China. They can't buy
Okay.
things, so all of a sudden the products, people who have decided to stay on and leave their products in China are like the Louis Vuitton of this world and the Gucci's of this world are making a killing here. Because it used to be stores in Hong Kong and stores in Paris, because when people travel, they would naturally buy. And now they can't travel, they will just buy locally. And, you know, we used to have this notion that if you buy European products in Shanghai, it's more expensive. But that's not the case anymore. They have no choice, they can't travel. I mean, you can still travel, but you would be quarantined when you come back.
No, we don't want that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what interests me in that conversation is more whether there's a kind of um, more of a want to investigate Chinese brands. We're still talking a lot about Gucci, Louis Vuitton, and you know there must be
Yes.
by now a kind of an identity, a Chinese identity emerging in luxury goods and in interiors, which you know for a long time things seem to be quite referential to the West, but the culture in China obviously is so deep and so wide in terms of references. Are people turning towards a slightly more Asian aesthetic?
Uh, Definitely, I think not just fashion. You can kind of see even within the fashion, there's a lot of Chinese brands, Chinese designers. Um, there is also the furniture industry. It's actually growing rapidly. A lot of people are, if you saw the fairs, it's not just Design Shanghai, but also the new fair coming, Shanghai Furniture Fair. It's filled with local brands, and to my surprise, some of them are actually quite good. Lighting brands. There's Neo that competes with Tesla, and there are a number of other brands and apps that are all quite Chinese based and Chinese centric.
And from an architecture point of view, do you think you're defining a new kind of Asian aesthetic, or you're doing something which is really international style? I mean, the skyline of Shanghai is kind of futuristic and sort of kind of Blade Runner in my imagination. But the rate of change means also that you've lost a lot of I guess historic buildings. But is there new Chinese aesthetic evolving?
I think by virtue of how we practice, Tom, we hardly, I mean, we don't have a high rise, for instance, and that's not our forte, and probably not our interest, because I feel like there's a lot of other problems within the city in the urban fabric. So if you look at urban renewal, adaptive reuse, buildings instead of being torn down, looking at buildings that are empty, and how do we, as Aldo Rossi would say, how do we reconfigure the typology and make it alive again rather than just constantly destroying and constantly creating something new. So by virtue of the things we do, and the need of this particular sector in terms of adaptive reuse, in terms of urban renewal, in terms of dealing with old and new, I think by virtue of doing that, there is a natural societal aesthetic. You can call it Chinese aesthetic, but I think, if you look at New York, for instance, you can call that are the high rises a New York thing, or is that an urban condition relevant to that particular period? So I think this particular period will lend itself a certain group of architects and projects that they create out of the necessity and the need of the society. So you can call it Chinese aesthetic. I think it's a sign of our times.
Well, yeah, but I think also there's a kind of a philosophical approach which is distinct and different, which I mean is probably slightly more evident in places like Japan, where there's been a kind of unbroken, and quite insular preservation of tradition, right? Whereas China's gone through a series of quite, shocking changes and wars and all of that. But underpinning a lot of Asian design is a series of philosophies, and I've always come up against, clients in China, particularly talking a lot about Feng Shui, for instance. And is that something that you're kind of conscious of, either yourself or from a client perspective, where very ancient rules about how you do things actually do still have an influence in the modern world?
Of course, I think by virtue of dealing with some of the clients, some of them are superstitious. I mean, I think there is some relevance to feng shui. It is, wind and water. There is relevance to that, but oftentimes people kind of skew it to their own interest. There are a lot of so-called feng shui masters that charge up an arm and a leg with a telescopic sort of bronze-plated, accoutrement that starts looking at the corner and says that's bad for the wind, that's bad for the water, which obviously is it's a hoax in itself. So we have to decipher what is good and bad. But yes, there are a number of ideology, the notion of layering, for instance, the notion of going from one room to another. When you look at Japan, actually, the idea of preservation is very similar to China. If you look at Venice, the idea of replication is exactly the same. You have to replicate every single brick, every dimension, every graph. If you look at a lot of the Japanese historical buildings, some of them are demolished and burned down. What they do is they try to understand the essence and the proportion of the space. They don't necessarily copy it directly. And I think the Chinese also have these lineage and thinking. And I think these things are coming back in a big way.
Have you got any tips for me then?
I'm sorry?
Have you got any tips?
That's right. So,
Yeah.
but
So you need also to, for once, just tell me finally how to pronounce Feng Shui.
well,
How do you pronounce it?
feng shui. I think you pronounce it
Correct.
quite okay.
Excellent. Good. And is there anything I need to understand about how to design, like for instance, for my shop? What's the tip for me? Rounded corners?
No, I think just be you. I think people like authenticity, and I think Tom Dixon being Tom Dixon is more important than Tom Dixon trying to be something else that he's not. And I think Chinese can tell authenticity. And if you try to be something that you are not, I think you are a British brand. You are a brand that deals with industrialization. I think, celebrate that, and I think you'll do well.
Yeah, just like I do, that we've had huge amounts of problems with copies
Yeah.
in China, and that thing of trying to tell the story of the product so that people understand the distinction between the original and the versions that you see so much in the market. We collectively, you and I, had a lot of difficulty, I think, in selling things which were 5 or 6 times the price for something that might look very similar.
Yeah.
Do you think that's something that people really do seek out now? Is the original?
I think there's a group of people that are going for the original. Slowly, you can kind of see from the reflection on the customer base for Design Republic, things have changed dramatically. And you can see a group of people, and obviously economically, when the country and the city is better and stronger naturally, there's really no time to be doing things that are not necessarily that much cheaper. But China is also a country, and China is really big, and you go from Beijing to Shanghai to Chengdu to Chongqing, they're all very different. People tend to kind of clump China as one, but there's actually a lot of different variation even within the country. If you think of the US, you'll understand that, or if you think of Europe as a whole, I think China is rather large and there are different nuances, but definitely the extremes happen in this country. So you would see, I have not carried a wallet for a year now, Tom. All I do is use my phone and my app. I could go anywhere. I charge my phone bills, my Uber rides, they call it Didi here, to my plane tickets, to restaurants. So in that sense, it's very advanced. I mean, I was driving to Hangzhou the other day, and I was shocked that then a person next door or a person next to me that was driving, he literally was sleeping on his Tesla, and the Tesla was self-driving. I mean, that's absolutely insane. I don't know if that's legal actually in Shanghai, but that was happening, and this was in the city. And so you have extreme cases. If you look at Comme des Garçons or even Seikai, which is in many ways a offshoot of Comme des Garçons, people are actually wearing them. In the West, people might actually buy the T-shirt and the Converse version with a heart and a T-shirt with a heart, and that's the extent. If you come to Shanghai street, you actually see people wearing big flower blouses, hats with big marking. That's just absolutely. So the sense of the daringness to experiment and to go all out on its extreme sense is really prevalent.
Disappointed that you're not wearing a big flowery blouse. Typical architect.
I do. I can't show you the details here, but it's actually quite nice. I have my subtlety.
Okay.
But of course,
So
there's
what fascinated me also about your practice is, is the breadth of your kind of interest. I mean, I think really that's where we have a real connection and a link where, you're not just somebody who's doing interiors or somebody who's building buildings. You've got these interests also in the micro, which is, for me, obviously your work in furniture. But also you extend your interest into food, just like we do here, right? So what's your latest kind of food adventures that you're doing over there?
actually we're experimenting on trying to figure out a new way of looking at Chinese. What is Chinese bistro? The notion of what is Chinese tapas, for instance. And so that's been quite interesting. I think oftentimes as architects, when we're in school, we're taught to think creatively, and then when we go to practice, we start to divide our chores. You know, people, you do restaurant design, you do hotel design, you do only tall towers, you only do marketing or do branding. I think that's unfortunate because I think we're limiting ourselves and our own profession, and we have ourselves to blame.
Yeah, and is there something else that you're doing which is a bit more secret or underground that
Well,
I don't know about?
if
I've been to restaurants.
yeah, if it's a secret, I can't tell you. No, we're completing a project. We won this competition for a project for Pernod Ricard. It's a first wine distill. They're doing a first Chinese distillery, a Chinese whiskey.
Okay.
In the middle of China, in Omeisan. So it's this beautiful scenic thing. So we're doing, obviously we did the master planning, we did the architecture, we did the interiors, we're also doing the labeling, and we're designing the bottles. So that's been quite exciting, and first phase is gonna open in a month and a half. So we're very excited. But we're also exploring different ideas on sort of the notion of what hospitality is, Tom, and the idea of what is Chinese hospitality.
I can't wait for that.
Yes,
How soon will that be ready? Because
we're
by then I'll be able to travel.
yes, we're starting on that. I think we're trying to see the understanding, the sensibility of dealing with this particular typology and coming up with something interesting.
But tell me more. How do you define Chinese hospitality as distinct from, say, European?
It is not so distinct. It is the idea of, there's this term called 客栈, meaning people who used to go in and have stops, different stops. Instead of purely staying, they have little stops to refill themselves. And so we start thinking to ourselves, are there options in which you can come in and only rent part of a hotel? Is it just a bed? Is it just a restroom? Is it just a shower area? And sort of try to break the whole convention of the room and break it up a little bit more. Um, and so we've been exploring this idea with a group of people and also with a group of hoteliers that are starting to think outside the box. And there are real needs because, you know, people sometimes would just want to sleep. There are a lot of public toilets, and or vice versa, they might just need to shower and not necessarily sleep.
Okay, amazing. Deconstructed hospitality, that's fantastic.
Yes.
And when do you think you'll be able to travel again internationally? When you're coming to London?
I don't know. I don't know. I think it's been a great year that I actually have every reason to just kind of rest and actually focus on the practice, focus on all the things that we're doing here. Maybe I'm obviously this fall I'm committed to teach at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, so I have to go back. So it's either online or actually in person. That I'm not sure yet, but definitely I'm slated to be at Yale for next spring, so that I have to travel. I have no choice.
Okay. Well, yeah, that doesn't really take you through London, so I guess I'm going to have to come to Shanghai to see
Well,
you.
no, I can come to London. I'd love to come to London. Every excuse to try, you know, to try Isaac McHale's new restaurant or your restaurant or Barafina, all these places. I need to go.
Okay. Well, look, we'll make a date, I guess, for, yeah, in 6 months maybe. But in the meantime, Lyndon, thanks a lot for once more getting onto Zoom. You must be sick to death of being on screen if you're teaching as well through the digital medium. And I can't wait to see you in person. Say hi to Rosanna,
I
right,
will.
and the kids.
I will.